Good day, Pastor Scott Cady, St. Paul's Lutheran Church, continuing our overview of the New Testament for 7th and 8th grade confirmation in the fall of 2021. Today we're talking about the letters that Paul wrote to individuals. We've covered the letters that he wrote superficially, of course. I mean, you are supposed to read these letters and absorb them, but we're touching on them so you have a sense of their context and the possible themes that you'll find there. So Paul wrote these letters to communities, Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, and so on. Then he also wrote a series of brief epistles, and they are brief, to three individuals. There are two letters addressed to a young man named Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. There's an epistle addressed to a fellow named Titus, and then there's one to Philemon. And we're going to focus a little more on that one. The first three, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are they're epistles filled with advice about how to guide a community. What has happened is that Paul has been instrumental in lifting up these new leaders for these churches. Now, whether he specifically, personally appointed them and made them the overseers, the priests, the pastors, or whatever title they were to use in those settings, or whether he was part of a committee that did that, or whether he was only aware that they had been raised up to that office, is not always clear. But what is clear is that, certainly in Timothy, it's very, very clear that youth is involved. In other words, he's younger than many of the members that he is called to be an overseer for. We assume, at least I assume from what I've read, that these three people were what we would typically today think of either as a pastor, if these congregations were relatively manageable, or if maybe there was a city with 3 or 4 house churches in it, maybe this person would be like a bishop, kind of overseeing several congregations at once. But youth was involved, and there were controversies involved. Churches are made of people. People are different from one another, and so there are spats and conflicts and confusions, and the leader is supposed to, in a gentle, humble, servant-minded way, excuse me, find a way to assist the congregation to find its way back to a Christ-like way of living and a seeking of Christ's mind in matters that could be divisive. So that's what these three letters are about, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. How to assess some of these issues and how to go about guiding the congregation through them. That being said, these letters are quite useful for the average Christian. They're not only meant to be read by pastors or by bishops. These young men had a calling to leadership, but within the letters there is much that can buoy up the faith or guide the decisions of ordinary Christians of all times and places. I want to spend a little bit of time on that last one, though. Philemon. Philemon is a very unique letter, partly because of its circumstances. Philemon is not a bishop or a priest or a pastor or any of those things, at least as far as we know. Philemon he was a friend of Paul's, and Paul had converted him to the faith, to Christianity. Philemon had a slave. The slave's name was Onesimus. Onesimus ran away. He'd come to know Paul while Paul was converting his owner, Philemon, to the faith. And Onesimus wanted also to have this experience. So Onesimus ran away, and he ran to Paul, who at this particular time was in prison. But in prison you could have visitors, even servants, if you could afford them. So Onesimus becomes Paul's servant, essentially, and learns the faith and converts to Christianity. This is a problem, obviously. Our own history with servitude and enslavement tells us how tense and how close the relationship can become between master and slave. And the same thing was true then. I mean, it wasn't a racially based enslavement like we had in this country, but there were the other dynamics were similar. People learned to trust one another at certain points, but the enslaved people also wanted their freedom and more dignity and all kinds of things. So Onesimus has made this escape, and he's converted to the faith, and he really and Paul loves him. Paul loves this Onesimus, but he still also loves Philemon. So this most dramatic thing happens, and this is a letter which on the surface reading you could really miss a lot of this, but this is a letter worth pondering. It's short, quite short. I mean, you could read this whole letter in 10 minutes. Paul sends a letter back to Philemon, and at least some scholars, and I'm not a scholar, but I'm one of the people who believes this viewpoint. We think that he sent the letter by the hand of Onesimus. So the slave goes back to his master with a letter from the man that gave both of them an entryway into the Christian faith, and from the man who loves both of them. And Paul effectively says to Philemon, look, this is your runaway slave. I understand that. And you can do what you feel you need to do. But I want you, if you value our relationship, what I would like is for you to welcome him just like you would welcome me if it were me showing up at your house. Both of you owe me your lives. He's talking about their spiritual lives, of course, but he says that. And he says, effectively, between the lines, what he's saying is, I want you to treat Onesimus now not as your servant, not as your slave, but as your brother in Christ, with all the dignity and honor you would give to me personally if I walked in your door. And then I'd like you to grant him the freedom to come back and join me and continue working with me. The boldness of this kind of letter, the danger that Onesimus would be in, even carrying this letter back. I mean, and it's not just from Philemon. I mean, this is a whole social strata thing here. The word would be out in that town that Onesimus had fled from his master's home. Other people who had servants would be furious with him. And if Philemon does not adequately punish him for that, they're going to be mad at him too. Maybe violently mad. So there's a lot of risk involved here. And this is one of the ways in which we understand that the Christian faith, not just then, but even still today, does bear with it a certain kind of risk. We end up doing things in ways that the rest of the society doesn't quite understand, does not appreciate, in fact, even really rails against. I mean, today we have lots of issues of people who are not seen as receiving full dignity and equality. And the church, when it's true to its own calling, has to keep saying, but we need to do that. We need to treat people that way. And it raises hackles if we push that theme strongly and clearly and consistently. So take time to pull up Philemon. Go ahead and read it. With this background that I've given you now, and try to imagine the characters involved. It would make a great short movie, I think, or play of some kind, of how it is that a person who was once a master, a person who was once a slave, who now both are Christians and trying to live a Christ-like life, are to relate to one another, how they are to kind of bear witness to their new relationship to the world, whether Onesimus is going to be able to be free to go back to Paul and assist him. Again, we don't know for sure. I don't know for sure if this is true, but there was an early bishop in the church not long after this time whose name was Onesimus. It's possible that this same man went on to become a leader in the church himself. If not, a later leader took that name based on, perhaps based on this book, seeing himself as a servant leader, grateful for his freedom from slavery, but also grateful for his new freedom and new life in Christ. So those are the personal letters from Paul, and it concludes our conversation about Paul. So next video we'll move on to some of the other letters or documents that make up the New Testament. May God's peace be with you.